So hopefully this is the session that you actually wanted to see. So this is a look at club licensing for the UK. Because we've only got 45-50 minutes, we're going to concentrate on the football conference and some of the changes that have happened at that level, and then kind of look at those, the pros and the cons of what they've done, and then kind of widen that out to the other leagues and the UK as a whole. There will be plenty of time for discussion and debate, looking at the people in the room. I know we've got some great brains to get onto this subject too, but we're going to start off by Nick and myself basically being a bit of a double act to walk through some of the changes that have been made. So I should introduce Nick next to me. So Nick has had many roles in football. He used to be in the dark side and worked for West Ham United as the finance director. I'm very pleased to say that we've brought him to the good side, and he does a bit of work for SD Club Development, and has done some work with some of our trusts and clubs looking to take over clubs at conference level, which is why a lot of the knowledge has come into this presentation. So, firstly, we'll go through the conference, what they've tried to do. So, just to give you an idea of how they come about to make regulatory changes at football conference level. The FA have a fairly active role, I'd say, in helping the conference come up with rule changes, which would be considered to be around licensing issues, and in some senses, I suppose you could say, well, the FA, which we'll come on to later, the overall regulator of the game, and should have final say. But in reality, what happens is this role is delegated, I suppose, in this sense, to the football conference. But the drafting and coming up with some of the changes that are made are heavily influenced by the FA. In fact, a lot of the wording and the final outcomes come from the FA, from the brilliantly named head of integrity department at the FA. So, and I think one of the things why we looked at the football conference as well is actually they've been ahead of the curve in terms of trying to do things to change the structure. They've recognised some problems, and they've actually made changes which are different, but they've made them before some of the other leagues. They've recognised this problem. Now, what the football conference was setting out to achieve really is, I think, that's fine. It can be encapsulated in 2 points. So they wanted to reduce the anti-competitive nature of the competition. There were clubs that were essentially, and still are, financially doping their way to success. They and other directors of these clubs were getting a bit annoyed that clubs were walking into playoffs competitions at the end of the season and they didn't have tax bills and various other creditors settled. So they wanted to reduce that anti-competitive nature of the competition. And of course, they've got a product. They don't want to be spending all their time trying to ensure that clubs can just survive the season. So we've all seen instances like Chester and the effect that can have on the competition when a club drops out mid-season, and the effect that has on all the teams that have already played them, and it's an absolute headache and nightmare. So they want clubs to survive the season. That's what they've set out to achieve. Okay. Just to chuck in some extra thoughts from us, this, just to start things off, is what we think a good licence system should incorporate, as well as those 2 points. And as I say, once we go through, at the end, we're going to bring out some discussion points, and we want to, widen the discussion and get your comments. So, to take you through these, so standardisation. So licensing needs to work between the different leagues, which is fairly self-explanatory, really. But at the moment, arguably, leagues down the pecking order are having to mop up and deal with the problems of the lack of regulation in the leagues above. And because of the power play in terms of money coming through the game, they're at a bit of a loss as to the influence they can have. So it needs to work between the different leagues. Kind of picking up almost on the first point I accidentally made, is an independent regulator that oversees the game. So follows on a lot from what was going on a minute ago downstairs, but the FA is the governing overall governing body for association football in England. So should it not be independently regulating these licensing systems? We can get on to a bit about what kind of actually happens, but I think arguably, well, not arguably, it doesn't happen at the moment, certainly not in an independent fashion. Badly run clubs need to be exposed at an early stage. I'm not going to dwell on this too much because there's quite a lot more on this later. Debt needs to become less dominant than equity. Again, this is covered a lot more in great detail, so we'll pick that up. And, quite obviously, something that we've all seen probably at every single one of our clubs, I would imagine, that clubs and their assets should not be put at risk from short-term speculative owners. Not all owners are short-term speculative owners, but as the system is set up at the moment, it doesn't exactly do much to stop that situation developing. So, going to run through 4 slides that the conference have done, and just pick up on a few positives and negatives. So I've got my doom merchant here, Nick. He's going to be the negatives, and I'll do a few positives. So, payroll reporting. The Football Conference were the first league in England to have this direct line of contact with HMRC. What that actually means is they have quarterly reporting, which confirms up-to-date payments. Again, which will come as no great, it's not some amazing thing that it took hours to come up with. It's quite clear that most clubs that go into insolvency events are often to do with HMRC because they're a more aggressive creditor. So this was an attempt to try and deal with that. That means that any default is notified to the Football Conference within 2 days of the end of month due date. And there's sanctions for non-compliance, non-payment and false reporting, which we have seen already. So they're the positives.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I'm really going to try to be a doom merchant. What we've tried to do is look at the regulations that are in place, which in themselves are very worthy. It's clear what they're trying to achieve. All we're trying to do is say, do they go far enough, or could you maybe tackle this a different way and achieve more effective regulation? So there are gaps in the system, and when you look at it from a dispassionate point of view, I think you do identify some weaknesses, and that's what we're trying to highlight today. So clearly regulations are no good whatsoever if they're not policed. The quarterly reports are to June, September, December, March. Where you have an obvious gaping gap, huge gap, is that then clubs conceivably might be up to date at the end of March and then default in April and May, and that's the key period when clubs are trying to make that last push for promotion. The League and the FA have quite rightly highlighted that they do not want clubs winning promotion while racking up debt. Yet there is no mechanism for alerting the league if there is a default in those last few months where the club could conceivably achieve promotion while defaulting with HMRC. They have a means via the direct contact with HMRC to identify this, but equally it seemed to us that the quarterly reporting should either be adjusted so that the final report is the end of May, or you have an additional report. Perhaps most importantly, there should be explicit sanctions for non-payment of those final 2 periods. What they are, we can debate. The sanctions for non-compliance already in place include a registration embargo that perhaps would be something clubs would live with if they've achieved promotion. There is the option of a points deduction or withholding central funds. Maybe those should be enforced. That's something we can come back to, the type of sanctions that we would want. But certainly I think we probably all agree that the regulations are fairly toothless unless there is that final check that clubs are winning promotion with a clean bill of health.
Yeah. So this is one that got us quite excited actually, which is fairly new, which is does start to look like licensing as perhaps some of us would know it. So club budgets actually have to be approved at the start of the season. So it's proactive licensing, which has been missing from the debate for a long time, again, whether it goes far enough, I'm not sure, but at least clubs are having to provide club budgets before they embark on the season. So on review of those budgets, the conference can demand additional monitoring, they can impose embargoes, or even require bonds from clubs, which again is a step further than we've seen before. And there's the monitoring that they state is based on a variance of 15% on income and costs, which again, if that dramatically differs, can open up sanctions.
Yeah, so again, we're not trying to question the rules that are in place. It's really an issue as to whether they go far enough and achieve the objective, the objectives that were outlined at the outset. Budgets are something that are required in other leagues. They're certainly required in the Premier League and the Championship now, and they're required in many overseas countries. What seems to me unusual in the case of the conference is that although there is this obligation to report to the league if you suddenly find that you have a variance on your budget of more than 15%, it doesn't seem to me there's any realistic way of the league to verify this, because clubs are not required to submit detailed year-end accounts, which would allow the league to check whether there had indeed been a greater variance. Put simply, if clubs are just failing to provide the league with information when they are concerned about a variance, it doesn't seem that the league has any means whatsoever to check whether that is the case. Equally, there's no consistency, there seems to be no standard requirement for the method in which the budget should be submitted, no standard template. And perhaps most importantly, there doesn't seem to be any requirement to submit a cash flow statement of any sort, because profit and loss budgets are all well and good, but it's the actual cash requirement of the club for the season which is going to determine whether it can meet its liabilities over the season, which obviously is a critical issue for the league and for supporters as well. One alternative which we thought we would consider is the salary cost management protocol which has been implemented in Leagues 1 and 2. And for those of you that are not familiar with it, this is a requirement that clubs in those leagues, their player wage bill should be no more than 55 or 60% of their total income for the year. And the leagues require them to submit information to demonstrate compliance with the protocol, and the league has the means to monitor it in the sense that all player registrations obviously are with the league and they have copies of all contracts. The one concession that is permitted is that within turnover, clubs can include amounts that are paid into the club by owners either by way of non-returnable donation or equity. Not loan, it has to be donation or equity. So if a club is in danger of breaching the percentage of income, an owner has the option of investing further funds, but he has to invest them permanently. He cannot withdraw them at a later stage. By contrast, it's something we'll deal with shortly on owner loans in the conference. There is a facility within the conference for owners to provide more temporary support. So it's just an option we think may be worth considering, is whether the conference should have a consistent approach with the Football League, Leagues 1 and 2, in terms of the financial licensing obligations.
Okay. So Nick just touched on there. So loans, which need to be declared, and there needs to be approval of unbudgeted loans that might be required by clubs. So that in itself starts to look a bit more transparent than what many of us know from our clubs in the past. And if further loans are required during the season, then there is additional monitoring that takes place. So it triggers that, I suppose, suspicion, or a greater deal of resources then applied to that club. Another interesting thing that exists is loans can only be repaid when the club can prove that other arrears have been repaid first, which arguably is an attempt to address a problem that has existed for a long time, where individuals come into a club and can wreck it, but they can financially come out stronger or no worse off. So their loans in theory need to be repaid only once other arrears have been repaid.
Yeah, again, the ideas are very good. Dealing with the last point that James just made, I think timing is so important, because if the league is looking at the information that is required to be submitted, they're looking at a very brief window indeed, of no more than a season, but conceivably by February, March, April, they're looking at a period of a couple of months. And there may well be a brief window when the club is in a good enough state to allow directors and owners' loans to be repaid. But the league needs to, in my view, to be looking at a longer period than a couple of months, because the club's then got to face the summer months with no income, possibly ongoing obligations to meet. And under the terms of its own regulations, the league cannot look at that period until later in the day, and they may well be granting permission for the club to repay directors' loans without appreciating that there's a very imminent cash crisis going to emerge within the next month or so. We touched on the issue of donations or equity being preferable, and that would be the way it has to be done in Leagues 1 and 2. I think most of us would agree that if the owner has to provide support, it would be preferable if it was that the money was submitted long term rather than just very briefly. That I'll count. The fourth point, the third point, security. That's one that's very dear to my heart, because I think what we see so often is an owner who is providing what initially is short-term support. He may then find that it has to be left in longer. He may have an ulterior motive, but the owner who then decides he will take security over the stadium. Now, it seems to me it's a bit of an anomaly in the conference rules that if a club wishes to relocate its stadium or where it plays its games, it has to obtain league consent. If it wishes to grant an option over the stadium or to grant a charge over the stadium, it merely has to notify the league. The league hasn't got the opportunity to withhold consent, it merely has to be notified. And as I say, that seems to me to be a glaring anomaly because, as I'm sure we all know, there's many instances when what started off as an apparently short-term loan from the owner turns into a longer-term loan, becomes secured on the stadium, the club then can't repay the loan, the owner says, well, I'm going to exercise my rights over the security, I'll transfer ownership of the stadium, and the club is left homeless, and all sorts of things happen after that. So it would be the simplest thing possible for the league to demand that any transactions of that nature there has to be formal consent from the league. And then the last point is one we'll return to shortly when we look at insolvency situations, but I think we perhaps need to question whether owners' loans should rank alongside other creditors in an insolvency situation.
Oops. So, yeah, everyone's favourite topic, insolvency. So, tougher sanctions, and anyone who has had the pleasure of looking at the conference rules in detail or following conference insolvency practice will know about this. They are by far the toughest in any of the leagues. So tougher sanctions for clubs entering into insolvency events. So paying off all non-football creditors in full over 3 years, rather than the kind of traditional route which you see in the Football League, which is the CVA, Company Voluntary Agreement, where potentially a pennies in the pound deal can be pulled off. And we'll come on to what that actually means in terms of impact with Nick in a second. But in terms of, I suppose, recognising a problem and trying to be quite out there in really stopping clubs from cheating, I can understand where that's come from, and also trying to be fair to local creditors in the community. Consistent rules in the non-league game. This perhaps can be picked up at the end, but this is really again talking about the FA's increased role in actually drafting and producing these rules in the non-league and the non-league pyramid, and how that is affected. They have a much more active role than they do in the Football League and the Premier League. There's the mandatory 10-point deduction for any entering into an insolvency event, and the subsequent sanctions are all really based on how they come out of that insolvency situation. So, but it's a 10-point deduction just to start with, by or large, depending on the timing. And on that point, it can make clubs ineligible for playoffs or promotion, or subject to automatic relegation, which again is admirable when you think what they're trying to achieve at the start in terms of not allowing clubs to in theory be promoted or enter the playoffs when they haven't kept up with paying their bills. So
yeah, again, as James said, the intention's admirable, but what we've been asking ourselves is whether the rules actually achieve the objective they set out to achieve. And dealing with the first point, we've had direct experience of this with one club where, although the league is saying creditors have to be paid in full, what happens in practice is that the would-be owners, new owners, and indeed in the instance we experienced, the administrators themselves were merely putting pressure on creditors not to submit the full value of their claim in the CVA, but accept a compromise before the CVA occurred, where the creditor might only accept 30p in the pound and then submit their claim in a reduced amount. So as far as the conference is concerned, that 30p in the pound had been paid in full. The conference clearly is unaware that the original claim was for more than 3 times that amount. So worthwhile objective, but in practice people are finding ways to circumvent it, and that's really extremely frustrating. It's also the case, obviously, that for clubs that are relegated, they could find themselves having negotiated a compromise CVA while in the Football League. They then get relegated before the CVA has been fully settled, and under conference rules they then have to agree to pay their creditors in full, and that does seem to be unduly harsh on these clubs. So that was the second point. Dealing with the third point about the rules favouring creditors who directors or owners who have submitted or provided loans. I think that follows on from the point we made in the previous slide, that directors provide what might be short-term loans to support the club fails, those loans would still rank alongside other creditors in a CVA situation. And again, we found with clubs we were advising last year that you had a situation where the outgoing directors, the former directors, because of the size of their loans, had a quite disproportionate influence in the voting power in a CVA. If they supported the group bidding to take over the club, their votes were very influential. In this specific instance, the bid we were advising, the Supporters Trust bid, the directors would not have voted in favour of it, and obviously their votes were critical in that instance, and we're just questioning whether that is a reasonable situation. It's made more anomalous by the fact that, in theory, a bid supported by the directors, maybe the former directors looking to take the club on again out of administration, they could waive their claim for the purposes of the CVA. If they're successful in acquiring control of the club, they could still have their loans repaid post-CVA, because the conference would have no way whatsoever of policing that. So they may be waiving their claim for the purpose of the CVA, but nevertheless obtaining repayment subsequently. I'm not saying that has happened in this instance, but they would be able to do that. And then the last point, I question whether it is necessary to insist that football creditors are paid immediately. If clubs have complied in other regards with meeting their obligations, it seems to me there should be the flexibility to allow them to pay football creditors over a 2 to 3 year period, if the football creditors are happy to do that to allow the club to survive. And so I just want to make one last point. I think just trying to pull this together. Arguably, the insolvency rules as they stand are perhaps punishing would-be new owners and the supporters of those clubs, whereas the previous owners who've allowed the situation to develop have not been subject to more checks at an earlier stage that might have prevented this situation arising.
I was just going to say, Anna, we'll just go a little summary and then basically it's the rest is discussion, if that's all right. So just kind of like reflecting on all that, which is quite dry material, albeit I know a lot of you in here actively love this stuff, so that makes me feel happy. So kind of like going back to the question, what does a good club licensing system look like in the UK? Just kind of like want to take a bit of that and chuck out some questions, and then we can have a good debate on it, really. So a few of these points, personal little one that always annoys me is the attention. I mean, I can understand it, but the attention that is paid to owners and directors, but fit and proper persons. Are we missing the point? Is it fit and proper business plans? So we can discuss that in a sec. Pre-season budget reporting. We've heard some changes that have been made. A start, but comparable to Germany. In Germany, they've got a licensing system that is revered around the world, and one of the reasons for that is that they have a net assets test each year on year, which in sort of layman's terms means that their assets are worth more than their liabilities, and they're monitored and checked year on year. And there's a liquidity aspect to it in terms of can they get a game on at any time? Can they pay everyone at any time? And what happens if things go wrong? Have they got a plan in place in basic terms? Well-run clubs need to be rewarded, are they? If anyone saw what happened to so I think this comes in two ways. There's the sanctions and punishment of clubs that are financially doping, and anyone who saw the change to the Football League financial fair play tax recently, that was quite admirable in some aspects, that essentially the likes of QPR and West Ham and these guys who essentially buy their way up to the Premier League should then pay a fair play tax back to clubs that are doing it right. That had a nice ring to it until they changed that to diverting that money to charity, which is all very well and good, but it does sort of defeat the point of what we're trying to achieve, rewarding well-run clubs. So there's that side, or then there's why not actually divert more money from the central contracts and revenue to clubs that are doing it right in the first place. Should more money be spent on monitoring and implementation of licensing? One of my favourite, if that's the right word, quotes in recent time was from Greg Clark, which said last year, the Football League has no way of independently verifying the ownership of clubs. It's the chair of the Football League last year, which is fantastically, horribly scary. And if this is so important, and we've got so much money in the game, and we keep hearing these cries for help, and I know, for example, some of the people at the FA are fantastic individuals trying to do their best, but they're up against an absolute mountain. So surely this should be more of a priority, and there should be more resource put towards it. Would be a thought we have. Should football creditors, well, it's a debate in itself, but should they be paid in instalments rather than in full, is another question. Do they actually get paid in instalments in a roundabout way? Should we just be a bit more realistic about what actually happens, and have a fair, transparent system perhaps? Should there not be more transparency to supporters and their community around these sort of decisions? We all know what happens if a club gets a sanction or a transfer embargo. We don't hear about it officially, but we hear about it from the manager's press conference. So, why not just kind of bite the bullet and get this out in the open, rather than kind of fudging it around the sides? As Nick said earlier, why not league consent required for major transactions concerning stadiums? This happens to a point, but it doesn't happen as far as we believe it should, particularly with borrowing. Or better still, what about protected rights for supporters and community over some of these major issues, which obviously, again, is highly topical and being debated downstairs. Final 2 points, and then we'll open it up. So, owners and directors test. Can it be subjective? that's probably a session in itself. But time and time again, we hear kind of cries of help that we can't stop these people getting into football based on the rules that we've got. But equally, how can we stop people because we don't like the cut of their jib taking over football clubs?
Can they be objective?
Well, I suppose at the moment what I'm saying is they're very much objective in terms of, have you been expelled from a sports governing body? Have you? Are you? Sorry, yeah, the other way round. So you've been.
It should be more discretionary.
Sorry, discretionary. Yeah.
It reads bluntly as if can it be arbitrary?
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So.
Yeah. No, I see what you mean.
Yeah, and final point really is if you have rules, enforce them, don't change them, which again we've seen recently, which to be fair we've seen at the moment with the football conference and some of the clubs at the moment that are in trouble, which look like the likes of Salisbury and Hereford and a few others have failed in terms of what their obligations are, but yet it hasn't been followed through. So there are a few thoughts from us. We've got 22 minutes before lunch.
James, something that's pertinent to all of those issues, can you just remind us what happens to the ownership of the playing licence and the event administration? That's something that goes to the receiver?
The what, sorry?
What happens to actual ownership of the playing licence of the club and the event club goes to the administration?
Okay, so do you mean the club's ability to play in the league? Yeah. So every club will have essentially a share which gives them the right to play in that league, and what has happened in the past, and Mark's good from Wrexham to be here, is obviously what they want to protect against is that a company that holds that share just gets shut down and a new one is formed and the share transfers across. So that's why it's much harder to basically set up a new entity if a club is in insolvency event, because there are a lot of checks and balances that the FA, so essentially a due diligence exercise to make sure that all those liabilities are transferred across to the new entity. So in that sense, that's a good point. We haven't touched on that, and that is difficult. And well, Mark.
Is that technically owned by the administrator, or does it revert back to the
Well,
league?
it remains owned by the club, but the administrator of the club is running the club in place of the club's directors.
Yeah.
Until the administration ends. But I think the league's opportunity to influence the outcome comes when the administrator is seeking to transfer the share to a new owner group, and the league can either agree to that transfer or can veto it.
Yeah.
In addition to that, when we did our events, we had something similar. We submitted everything that planning to the election, and then we had a meeting at the conference, and when we went,
And for great nerds amongst, there's a whole thing around the contingent liabilities, wasn't there? But even that was then contingent liabilities, and what were there were like three under levels, weren't there, Mark? Or kind of.
It's a long process, and again, we were subject to a bond at the time. So the league were holding that as well. So they have a lot. But it's all in their rule book, and
Yeah.
the league's board follow their rules, which is agreed on that. League at the final stage.
I'm going to chuck one more quote out there. We might get a bit of discussion, which again is from my friend Greg Clark from last year. So he said, everyone thinks the league has infinite power and we can tell the clubs what to do, but there are sovereign, independent businesses governed by company insolvency law, and we have to obey it just as they do. So this is the guy who is chair of the Football League last year, who obviously hasn't recognised that a licensing system can actually change some of the powers that they have. But there we go. Sorry, let's have some questions.
He's right there, but why we got a lot of these changes in, we used to throw that as regular 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And we said, right, you've got company law, you've got European law, that's fair enough.
Yeah.
I can buy Barnsley Football Club, but
Yeah.
playing your league, which is the membership league, I've got to abide by their rules.
Yeah.
So I can buy the club, but I
Yeah.
can't have the share.
And
that's why we're where we are now.
yeah. And that's
We've now
what,
started enforcing that.
well, and it is quite remarkable that a guy who's chair of the Football League hasn't realised that last year, and hence, go on.
Well, I sat next to him in a game fairly recently, invited him along to bend his ear. Done Bradford AMC Wimbledon, so we were trying to give him a hard time about not taking any account of supporters-owned clubs, because we do represent 4 out of 72 of his members at the very least when it came through. And so he admitted, well, basically said, I only manage on behalf of the owners. The league is with the representatives of the 72 owners, so I manage on behalf of them. So I do what the majority of clubs tell me. So essentially, Turkey's voting for Christmas thing comes in. Actually, more than half of the teams in the league are owned by owners who don't want to see any of this. Therefore, he won't do it because the majority of people who vote for him won't do it.
I think the point is it doesn't have to be that.
It doesn't have to be, but that's his view of how the league is run. It's a league that is owned by the owners of the clubs.
That's exactly the same argument you get in the Premier League.
Yeah.
Which is the same argument
So
in
if-
the Premier League. Then the second thing that comes up to, which is the one I love your first quote for that, is he's then got a record saying he doesn't know who owns some of the clubs. So how the hell can he be representing the interests of owning a club and can't even find out who they are?
Yeah. Can now.
No, you can't.
Yeah.
And the fit and proper person's test is just. I mean, I had to pass the fit and proper owners test as director of Wimbledon. And I don't know if you remember the old when you went to America, you had to fill in the form that said, "Have you committed genocide?" It's like that, only this time it's, "Have you committed genocide?" And the next question will be, "Well, if you have you done it again within 4 years?" And so I'm amazed that someone actually ever failed it. But when Peter Estelle did, he still manages to act as a chairman of the club because he gets someone else to have it on his behalf.
Yeah.
But that's exactly why I said what I said downstairs.
Yeah.
Until you get an independent body that sets the rules
Yeah.
for all the leagues,
Yeah.
we're going to have to be, like we've done, slowly.
Yeah.
Because if we'd have sat down 15 years ago, a lot of this would have been in place.
Yeah.
But you've got to be
the
convinced.
role of the FA.
Well.
Yes.
They've advocated it because it's the money in the Premier League, providing they get their money from the Premier League.
To be absolutely fair to guys like Greg Clark and indeed Richard Scudamore at the Premier League, you know, the constitutions of those organisations are quite clear. That the Premier League is simpler. There are 20 owners, and Richard Scudamore is an employee of the Premier League Limited. Now, if he decides he's going to become a regulator who's going to ignore his 20 bosses, he's going to get his P45 fairly quickly. So, you know, it's all very well us saying that these guys should be above that, but they're going to have a very short career if they start trying to set themselves up as the game's regulators. The more realistic point is that they are not there to be regulators. The Premier League is there to make money for its 20 owners, and it is the FA that should be the regulator.
I mean, the point I'm going to make in response to that is, if the status quo is crap, then change the status quo. Don't use it as an excuse for not.
The problem with that is they're frightened of the breakaways. That's how the Premier League was formed in the first place.
Yeah, but the FA had to sanction that breakaway. The FA could have withheld approval.
Could have, but UEFA were ready to step in and take them like they still are now.
But I mean, you know, I think the kind of point it's an obvious point, isn't it? That the FA should be the ones that oversee this. They are technically the ones that oversee this, and they're delegating responsibility to the leagues. I mean, there is, I believe, a group called FARA, which which is a kind of supposed to be this body that oversees licensing type issues. But I think from the outside, it appears that I'm not sure that's an independent regulator in itself, because it's made up of people from the professional game anyway. And B, I don't see it. Maybe I'm looking in the wrong place, but I don't see it having an active enforcement role with the leagues themselves. But that's pretty obvious, isn't it? That basically the FA looks after football in this country, and it should have an independent body, exactly as Germany does. I mean, I was reading this fantastic. If you want to read about how it should be done, in the DCMS governance review, a guy called Christian Müller, who was the chief financial officer of the DFL in Germany, has written a whole page on how it works over there, and it is an independent body that properly regulates and licenses clubs. So before a season starts, they will look at a budget and they will look for proof. They'll look for contracts on commercial opportunities. They'll look at projections on season ticket income and cost. And if they don't like what they see, they'll say, I don't think that's right, mark it down. And unless that club can prove otherwise, ultimately they won't give them a license. It's called licensing. You give a license. You don't let people play. Now, I think what we've ended up with over here is all sorts of slightly complicated systems where they're often trying to punish clubs when if they could have just been more proactive about stopping these problems. That's where the resource should be. But sorry, John.
Can I pick up that point on punishment?
Yeah.
In your insolvency section, you had as a thumbs up a mandatory 10-point deduction for going into insolvency. I would argue very strongly that is a bad thing. The figure of 10 is arbitrary, and it has unequal outcomes.
Yeah.
I looked at 353 points deductions. It's absolutely clear, it's almost random how much punishment there is, whether it forces a relegation because it drops you down, or whether you get away with it. I found a case of Arsenal that had points deducted. The last year of the old first division, they had 3 points deducted and still won it. So it was just a joke deducting points.
Yeah.
And in terms of who it punishes, quite typically I found it punished new owners, not old owners.
Yeah.
And the classic example there was Luton Town, who ended up being deducted 27 points. The other two who were deducted 20 managed to stay up. They didn't. But it punished the new owners. The club itself was the source of whistleblowing. And I just thought it absolutely ludicrous that they were, in effect, compulsory relegated for putting their hands up and saying there's something dodgy going on here. The old owners got out, new owners came in, and they were relegated. At the one time they're struggling financially, forcing somebody to relegate is making their financial situation even worse. I just think that whole business of points deduction for financial irregularity is just dysfunctional.
That's
very good point.
They do the same as the Football League.
Well,
where the cut-off date is
there's
they do, and it's got they've got the option of holding it over till the following season, because otherwise clubs who think they stayed up by 11 points just go into administration on the last day.
That was put in because of Leeds United. They lost. They drew it against Ipswich, got relegated, and immediately went into administration. And lost 10 points.
It rang up at half time, didn't it?
No, it wasn't quite half time. It was within minutes of the final.
It was during the game.
As the final, he put them in, and they got relegated. Didn't get any points deduction because it came off. That's why that was put in. The 10 points was put in, and the argument was put in because if a club is overspending, 99% of that overspend will be on players. Therefore, they've got better players on the field than they should have, and therefore they're getting points Because we
Well,
shouldn't have.
in which case, it
And
would be
that's
more
why,
rational
that's the
to
rationale
say
behind it.
Yeah.
compulsory demotion
Yeah.
would have an equal outcome.
Yeah. Well,
It's this arbitrary 10 points.
yeah.
Sometimes
As I say, I think what's happened is you're absolutely right. The points deduction is punishing the wrong people, and
punishes the fan.
well, absolutely. So, you know, we were chatting before about all the time, effort, and resource on insolvency events and these punishments. If that could actually be applied to proactive, upfront monitoring and checking and checks and balances, I think it wouldn't be far off an equitable amount, and you know, you wouldn't have all these problems. And you know, you can't guarantee these clubs won't get into difficulty, but as Christian Miller puts in his paper, there's never been, as we all know, a club that's gone bust in Germany. There are other reasons for that, but there's never been one club. And look at what we're dealing with over here. But so I'll take Dave because he hasn't spoken, and then we'll come back to John.
I was just going to say, has anybody actually put a football club into administration in this week? Because I did it, and we did it 10 minutes before the end of the game, made that decision to do it. Because if we hadn't have done it this year, we would have been punished the next year. And we would probably have gone out of business the next year. Now the problem with us was that we had somebody who bought the ground and got us into, paid off our debts and that, but then remained on the board, and with the others then created more debts with the rest of the money that they had. And it isn't an easy thing to put a football club into administration. And we thought we would be in and out within a few weeks. And we were the last ones, because Cable actually saved us, the sports minister at the time, because he managed HMRC got the clubs out of business. And that's, you know, not an easy decision to make. And, you know, going into a football club, or being told you're out of business on a Friday night, walking around a football club, deciding who owns what and who is renting stuff, so you can get rid of everything, to maybe go out of business on a Monday. It's not an easy thing or an easy decision to make. And the problem is that all football clubs are allowed to do is to get into that stage. And that's where you've got to have this financial levelling, and it should be started at the start of the season. There's too much of this where you can go bust halfway through the season, or you can get somebody come in and promise you the world with money, but they won't deliver it because they'll either do it for a loan or never actually pay it.
Sorry, which one was that?
Cambridge United.
I think this really is very much the point we've been trying to make indirectly, I suppose, with these slides is, you know, the things like the quarterly reporting, the budgets, all the rest of it. They're meant to be an early warning system, and what we're saying is the early warning system as effective as it could be? If you make it more effective, you shouldn't have this need for retrospective insolvency provisions that are quite so onerous. And if you have an effective early warning system, maybe 1 or 2 clubs will go every 5 years, but you can maybe then treat them more supportively, because one would like to think they'll have gone bust through for different circumstances other than a lunatic owner.
Can I just ask you on the early warning system? Given that the clubs have to consent to HMRC reporting whether they pay their taxes or not, can't they also consent to report the player wages?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. No, I think that would be a good idea.
The improved budgeted payroll to be verified on a quarterly basis.
No, they should be obliged to report if there's ever a default on their football creditors as well. Now, the league will know if the transfer fee is unpaid. They won't know if the wages are unpaid until it gets into the media.
We had this situation with Dundee where we were punished for second administration in 7 years, and all the league focused on was the non-payment of debt to HMRC. Whereas it could be non-payment of debt from anybody, but actually pushes you over that cash flow balance point and into administration. But they've done absolutely nothing since. As far as I can tell, there's zero licensing in this sort of proactive sense in Scotland. When we came out of administration, we were asked to show previous year's accounts that were, of course, distorted by the
for paying players that you're registering. So, having seen that there is down here some regulation regarding, on the one hand, the percentage of revenue that can be spent on wages, and secondly, approval of a budget of those wages, there has to be the same check that is being adhered to. And if the clubs are willing to give permission for HMRC to disclose data, surely that should be the next step to say, does your payroll match up with what we told us it's going to be?
Yeah. We'll take Matthew and John, and then just a couple more.
One thing about the salary protocol and wages,
Yeah.
without naming names, doing things that's unfair, potentially illegal, we are still getting players coming to us with their agents. They're expecting to get paid some of their money round the back door, which wouldn't appear anywhere, wouldn't get through, because currently, where they currently are, the owner or director will pay a chunk of the money directly to them, therefore bypassing all of these roles. We can't, we won't, because the way we organise, we don't have anyone to pay money anyway. But whilst that goes on, a lot of these things are still difficult to regulate and bypass. I don't know how we get around
The only
that.
trouble with that is, that can't increase your debt because we can't show them your accounts anyway.
Can't, but that guy's expected to be paid now. The moment the director
But we can't come to you and say, I've got this contract. It says you've got to pay me £400 a week cash. So it's wrong, it's illegal, don't get me wrong. But
Well, I want. Well, do you want to have a quick? Sorry, go on.
Sorry, are players' agents in England registered? And is there a source, or is there somewhere you can go to make a complaint against that agent for making that action, or asking that? Therefore, if it keeps coming up to again and again, the same agents, you know, there will be an investigation.
But then again, you have the issue that then if a number of agents won't deal with you as a club because they think you're going to dock them in or whatever, you don't get players. It's a really difficult environment to be squeaky clean. Some people are.
I understand that situation. I'm saying, like, something has to be set up to try and deal with it, as opposed to say we can't deal with it. We're just trying to blind eye to it.
I think heavier licensing of agents is a completely separate issue. There'd be a lot to be said for it.
So we'll go with John, and then we'll wrap up, and we'll go and have some lunch. Go on.
You floated the idea of a bond, and I think that's certainly worth looking at with respect to how you punish insolvency. If you have a bond that had to be put up in order to issue a license, and the bond had to be put up by the owner, and you couldn't offset that on the club. It had to come as extra money, if you like, from the owner. Perhaps allied to a fit and proper persons test. Last question: have you got the ability to write a cheque to provide the bond, which we will hold? Because then, if they did go insolvent, the league can then claim the money from the bond. They're not punishing new owners. They're not punishing fans. They're punishing the people who took them into insolvency.
That's a very good point. And I just say, I think this encapsulates a little bit what it happens at the moment, because Mark will know from Wrexham that they had to put up a bond to kind of prove that basically they were getting into the playoffs and they were defaulting on their credits. Their use of bond is admirable, but it's still all retrospective down here. And what you're saying is absolutely right. It should be up front so that there is some risk, some skin in the game for the owners. And I think that in itself almost, and I think we should. I want to kind of close and say that
it would deter people like Stephen Vaughan.
Absolutely. I think there's an overall feel that there's been some innovative kind of thinking from the conference via the FA. I honestly believe that the FA having this